Welcome back, friends. So today's episode is going to be covering the power and influence of self-compassion. We're going to be talking about how we can turn that little critical voice in our head into an ally. So just like last episode, I've broken this one down into chapters. So to give a high-level overview, we're going to start with an introduction into self-compassion, including a definition and a bit of a distinction. We're going to talk in the second chapter about understanding our inner critic. So basically understanding its influence and its role. Then we're going to talk about key components of self-compassion, and this includes some differentiation between self-kindness, self-judgment, and a few other things. Then chapter 4 is going to be covering practical tips that we can use to cultivate self-compassion. Chapter 5 is overcoming obstacles. Chapter 6 is the role of self-compassion in successful relationships. And then we're going to wrap up by touching on a few scientific studies that I found that are related to the importance and the influence of self-compassion again. So I think, as always, the best place to start is by laying out a definition so we can all have a level playing field for this discussion. So one of the most common definitions I've found for self-compassion in literature is self-compassion involves treating yourself with the same kindness, concern, and support that you would show to a close friend or a family member. It's a practice rooted in mindfulness and the understanding that imperfection and failure are a part of the human experience. Self-compassion has been linked to numerous benefits, including reduced anxiety and depression, increased resilience, and better emotional coping skills. Now, having said this, I want to make a clear distinction between self-compassion and self-esteem. So the thing is that self-esteem, unfortunately, often depends on external achievements and comparisons to external factors, which means that it is very much contingent on external outcomes to determine your self-worth, whereas self-compassion is not contingent on anything. It is contingent on oneself. It's unconditional, and it doesn't fluctuate with failure or success. And in fact, there has been research by a prominent pioneer in self-compassion research, Dr. Christine Neff. And she highlighted that in her research, self-compassion led to a consistent increase in confidence and a consistent increase in self-love. So this is why I think it's important that we can make this clear distinction that self-compassion is something that comes from the inside, whereas self-esteem typically is something that comes from the outside. So this can now bring us to the second chapter, which is the understanding of our inner critic. So to begin with, I think it's important to understand its origin and its role in our lives. Typically, the inner critic develops from early life experiences or socialized influences, or, for example, anything that we have maybe internalized as an expectation. So in other words, a standard or a bar that we've set for ourselves on the inside that we might not be able to achieve on the outside, which may play a role in how we view ourselves. Now, in our early lives, in our early development of our species, the inner critic was often used to just help us survive, basically to keep us on our toes, to keep us anxious so that we were ready in case we needed to move, to evade, to take shelter, to find food, to hunt, to fight. But now it's very much become a detrimental side effect of modern expectation. So it can very much turn into the self-hate that we experience when we compare ourselves to someone else that's more successful, let's say at the same age or, regardless of age. But it has basically turned into this expectation of greatness that we are all supposed to achieve. Now, this obviously has pretty severe negative influences, and an overly harsh inner critic can very much lead to a negative cycle of self-judgment and extremely low self-esteem. And studies have shown that harsh criticism and harsh self-criticism, is linked to severe mental health consequences, like we've already mentioned before, like depression and anxiety. So it's important to also take a moment to highlight how influential and powerful our inner voice can be. So this is why I feel like it's very important that we all take a moment occasionally to reinforce and try and turn that voice into an ally. Now this brings us to the third chapter. So these are the key components of self-compassion. And there's a few things that I wanted to highlight. The first point is on the difference between self-kindness versus self-judgment. Now, self-kindness very much involves recognizing that being imperfect, failing, and experiencing life difficulties are inevitable. And you have to treat yourself kindly during these moments. And this practice can be enhanced through exercises, for example, like speaking to yourself in a compassionate tone, or for example, writing in a journal or just on a paper, writing yourself a letter in the moments that you're feeling really great about yourself, to those moments where you're actually going to be feeling kind of low and down and hard on yourself. This is a concept actually that I've heard spoken about quite regularly by a few other self-development influencers. It's basically tapping into that energy when when you're at a high state, and writing it down so you can really look back and appreciate yourself, appreciate things that you're doing when you're in that low state. So then we have to look at the difference between common humanity and isolation. Now, this is a little bit of an abstract one, but it made a lot of sense the more I dug into this. So this component involves realizing that suffering and personal inadequacies are part of a shared human experience. So when we can start acknowledging this, you can start to feel less isolated during your suffering or during times of hardship. And when you can reflect on these moments, like considering, for example, how someone else might also be experiencing a similar feeling or a difficulty, it can really help foster a sense of connectiveness between one another. And we all know that being connected and being social, as we are meant to be as a species, is one of the best things that you can do for your physical and your mental health. The next thing I wanted to talk about is mindfulness versus over-identification. Now, this is also a bit of a dichotomous point. So mindfulness, as I'm sure you are all aware, as I've drilled into your heads, is a self-compassion that typically involves a balanced approach to negative emotions so that feelings are neither suppressed nor exaggerated. So this practice often involves basically understanding and observing the emotions that you're feeling with an open-mindedness, with a curiosity, instead of a hyper-fixation and a hyper-identification. So you're basically trying to just sit back, allow whatever you're feeling to be felt, and observe how that feeling is kind of exhibiting itself in your body. This brings us to chapter 4. So I want to highlight a few practical techniques that we can use to cultivate self-compassion that I found. So the first one that I'd like to discuss is called a self-compassion break. And it's pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty simple. It basically is a practice where you take a few minutes every day. You can set an alarm or a timer on your phone, let's say, to remind you to do so. And this is more practical when you're actually going through a moment of hardship. But in those moments that when your alarm goes off, let's say, is when you speak to yourself 3 simple phrases. Something along the lines of, I understand this moment is of suffering. I understand that I'm feeling some pain. But you have to remind yourself that suffering is a part of life. And then you can go on to say, I will be kind to myself. So by taking this little moment, saying 3 phrases to yourself that you acknowledge that this moment contains suffering, then you acknowledge that suffering is a commonality of life. And then you reinforce to yourself that you will be kind to yourself regardless of the moment. So this basically helps to ground you and remind yourself that maybe you are going through something challenging, but it's not the end of the world, and that you still have to be kind and compassionate to yourself to get through this, because being negative is not going to help anything. No situation is benefited by being negative. So the second one that I wanted to discuss is journaling. Obviously, this is a pretty common technique, a pretty common methodology that people have used to help manage their self-compassion and their moments of hardship. It's kind of what I mentioned before, basically about how you can tap into those moments of high to look back on when you're feeling quite low. But what you can also do is keep a daily journal. So this way you're actually keeping a progressive timeline of your emotions, your feelings, your achievements, and everything. And especially when you're actually going through something a little bit challenging, writing it out can very much help to dissipate its impact and influence on you. I've noticed this personally plenty of times. Every time that there's been a ton on my mind, too much to think about, stress, I don't know, any sort of negative emotion, actually writing it out is a very effective method to get it out of your head and visualize it so that way you can see it's actually not that bad. So journaling is a highly recommended tool that I would suggest. Then there are, of course, affirmations and positive self-talk. So this kind of goes in line with what I was mentioning in the first point about taking a moment throughout every day, multiple times a day, or it could be less frequent. But you basically affirm to yourself that you are worthy of kindness, compassion, that you accept yourself, that you will, let's say, accomplish that goal that you have set out to accomplish. But you have to be consistent with this. This is obviously it delves into a little bit of the field of like manifestation and that kind of thing, but positive self-talk and manifestation are kind of intertwined a little bit. And the more I've kind of delved into that field, the more it actually does help, because it really is a psychological trick to yourself. If you're constantly seeing something, like if you're constantly seeing, oh, I will be okay, I will be better than ever, I will get that car, I will get that whatever, that job, I will finish my degree, like it's wiring it into your brain. So it makes it far easier for you to actually stick and align with whatever that goal is. And of course, by aligning and sticking with that goal, that only positively reinforces your perception of yourself. So it kind of is a full circle. Now, this brings us to chapter 5, overcoming obstacles for self-compassion. So the first thing I want to talk about is dealing with resistance. And this is kind of a bit of a double-edged sword when you practice self-compassion. But a lot of people believe that when you practice self-compassion, you might accidentally lead yourself into a field of, or a state of self-indulgence, or like of lack of responsibility. So in other words, a lack of accountability. But this needs to be addressed because it is crucially false. Self-compassion isn't about ignoring any faults or anything that might be going wrong or avoiding a problem or whatnot. It's about actually acknowledging that they exist and dealing with your faults, but in a passionate way, in a more loving way, and not ignoring them. So there is, again, research that was conducted by Dr. Christine Neff, who also, by the way, is the author of a great book called Self-Compassion: The Proven Power of Being Kind to Yourself. And she performed another body of work that basically showed that more self-compassion actually led to higher accountability in oneself, not the opposite. And this was very closely linked to the fact that when you care and love yourself and want the best for yourself, you're not going to let yourself slack on those things that you need to do. You're not going to push the work aside or push the exercise aside, or push whatever positive disciplined habit that you might be trying to put into place, which would benefit you. Then we have to talk about how we can actually transform our self-criticism into self-compassion, because transitioning from a harsh inner critic to a positive ally is no easy feat. It takes a lot of awareness and practice, awareness being the key there. So what I'd like to encourage everyone to do is, every time you're feeling any of those negative self-critical thoughts kind of swirling in your head, try and actively reframe them. So instead of telling yourself or catching yourself saying that I'm always a mess up, or I keep failing on this, or I can't believe I didn't do that, take a moment and say, you know what? I actually can take this as an opportunity to learn. I'm not always a mess up. I messed up this time. What can I do different next time? So what you're doing is taking this negative connotation, this negative sphere of hate, and turning it into, okay, it happened. What can I do to make sure it doesn't happen next time? So try very actively to do this. It takes a lot of practice, and of course, everybody's going to have moments where you still can't get yourself out of that funk, but it's important to keep practicing it, because we get better the longer we practice. Now this brings us to chapter 6. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of self-compassion in relationships. So the first thing I'd like to discuss is how self-compassion can really enhance empathy and connections between individuals. Practicing self-compassion can improve your ability to empathize with others, which of course deepens your connection with them. And understanding and forgiving your own flaws, you can actually appreciate other people's imperfections more deeply, because you can understand, like I mentioned before, that there is a deep connectedness between all of our experiences. Now, this can lead to far deeper and authentic relationships, and that's probably one of the biggest takeaways that we can all benefit from. We all want to have deep, meaningful connections with the people that we care about. And actually, studies have shown that people that practice self-compassion are often more compassionate and supportive partners in more intimate relationships as well, not just in friendships. And obviously, this extends far outwards as well. You could be a better friend to someone that's close to you. You could be a better family member. You could be a better employee. You could be a better boss. Of course, compassion is kind of ever flowing throughout our lives, and it's important that we can foster and practice it as well. The second thing that I wanted to discuss is how you can set boundaries with kindness, because setting boundaries is one of the most compassionate things that you can do for yourself. It very much shows that you respect yourself. So typically, self-compassion involves recognizing your own needs and your limitations and then setting those boundaries accordingly. So it doesn't mean that you're being selfish, but you're basically acknowledging and respecting your capabilities in a given moment, how you're feeling mentally, physically, what you're capable of, and actually acting accordingly. So in other words, the best thing that you can do, for example, is if you're feeling overwhelmed, not to take on additional responsibilities. And not saying so in a harsh way, but just in a way that expresses kindness to yourself, allowing yourself to take that moment of rest. So please give it a go. And finally, the last chapter, I would like to touch on a couple key takeaways from some scientific literature behind the nature of self-compassion. So the first fact that I wanted to show is that numerous studies have highlighted that the benefits of self-compassion should not be taken for granted. There was a huge study published in the Journal of Research in Personality where they found that self-compassion contributes far more to consistent happiness and less reactivity to negative events. In other words, control over your emotions, control over your perception of an outcome, and the ability to disconnect yourself from those external factors. I also wanted to highlight some neurological impacts that have been documented in quite a few studies. So a plethora of bodies of research found that the active practice of self-compassion activated the parasympathetic nervous system in the brain, which is the portion which regulates emotional reactivity. So in other words, once again, it helped people stay in control of their emotions during hard external influences. And the one biggest release was in oxytocin, which is a chemical that basically makes you feel calmer, happier, more content, along with also, of course, the release of the other happy chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. So there is a huge unanimous agreement on how the active practice of self-compassion can truly change the chemical makeup of your brain for the better and for the long term. This is a permanent change which can really help you build off of every experience that you've had so far. So that's it, everybody. I hope everybody really enjoyed this episode. I hope it gives you a minute to actually kind of pause, actively reflect on your self-perception, how you talk to yourself, how you will talk to yourself in the future. Better be changing. And I hope that this is kind of a field that you can keep exploring. It's something that is an ongoing practice, obviously, that we all have to be, all have to be conscious and aware of pursuing, because once again, this not only helps yourself, but it also helps everybody that's in your life as well. Because when you can start loving yourself more, you can start loving them more. So that's it, everybody. Thank you very much. Peace.